Let's go. Good morning and welcome to the launch of the Equality Republic. These are unprecedented times, and unprecedented times calls for unprecedented thinking, and that's what we hope we're going to deliver for you this morning with some fantastic speakers, thinking out loud on the question of equalities, but pushing the boundaries, asking a new set of questions and challenges about how we can make equalities work in the 21st century. My name is Robert Beckford. I'm your host for this morning, and early, we should be done by 12 o'clock, so your host for this morning. I'm going to be introducing our speakers, but before we get going, just a few announcements regarding Zoom protocol. I'm sure you're all used to using Zoom by now and all the issues that go along with it. Just to say that the questions, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, our panelists this morning, please feel free to use the chat. The chat is going to be monitored throughout, and the questions that you raise will be fed into the panelists. So if you want to even just go ahead right now and announce yourself, your presence, your name, age, bank account details would be quite useful. And I'm just joking about the bank account details, you do not need to add those in. But if you want to just say a hi and a shout out so we know that you're here at this time, that's great. These are unprecedented times. I spent several years chasing a world famous driver and asking him if he would support some anti-racist projects that we were engaged with nationally, working with young people. He said, oh, incredibly difficult to get hold of him. Years and years and years he was trying. So I was quite surprised when yesterday I saw this same unnamed driver stand on the podium after winning a race and giving the Black Power salute. So I guess these are unprecedented times, and we should have some serious thinking about what equalities means within this brave new world. And to kick off and describe the meaning of the Equality Republic and what this means going forward is the director of BRAP, Joy Warmington.
Thanks, Robert, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here this morning. So I just really wanted to do two things: to tell you a little bit about BRAP for those of you that don't know anything about the organisation, and to tell you a little bit about the Equality Republic. So first of all, BRAP is an equality and human rights charity. We're a national charity. We're 21 years old this year, so you can see how young and sprightly we all look. And our roots began in Birmingham. We began in race equality, but we quickly knew that we needed to focus on the importance of intersectionality and human rights. And these things are very integral to what we do and the work that we do. I wanted to give a shout out to the fact that we are standing here on the backs of many people who've actually worked at BRAP, both staff and volunteers, and they've made the organisation what it is today. But I also wanted to praise very much our existing team, whose passion and commitment continues to make BRAP one of the most interesting and progressive equality organisations in the UK, if not the world. So, like many organisations, we're ambitious for this agenda, but we do believe that we could be doing much better by each other and for each other. And we believe that we can create a better world, and we hold that dream, and we hold that dream very central to what we do as an organisation. And we also recognise that we need to own up to historic and current injustices if we're going to actually get some of this stuff done. Before the lockdown, we were planning this event. We were planning to celebrate 21 years of the organisation and the launch of the Equality Republic. And part of the reason we felt it was important to have a new equalities movement, because that's really what this Equality Republic is about. It's around creating a new movement for equality, is that so many people look for equality to be doing something. The equality person in an organisation, the person who holds that agenda, often unfairly is looked at as the individual that's actually going to deliver everything. It's an isolated place. It's a place that can be quite tick boxy and unfair. And we really wanted to try and think about how we can make that place, that space that equalities practitioners occupy, much more meaningful. So that's really part of the reason we're here today. We also wanted to ensure that organisations could join the Equality Republic, because we also recognise that in a way there's a push-pull. So you can only do wonderful things as an equality practitioner if you have organisations that sign up to do better. So we do need organisations that want to take a risk, that want to set their ambitions higher, that want to move beyond what we've been currently doing, because we can continue to do all of this stuff and get absolutely nowhere. And much of what BRAP's Foundation has been built on has been around evidence-based practice and trying to evaluate and monitor what we do so that we have an opportunity to punch higher, to get beyond some of where we are today. And actually, it links really well to what's happening in the current environment. So we were planning this before COVID-19, before Black Lives Matters, but this is just so important now. So we think that the Equalities Republic is not just about individuals or organisations, it's part of a social justice movement, because you can't be working in this field without having social justice as your heart. So we want this to be something that's honest, we want it to be something that's courageous, and we want it to be something that's transformative. And our plan really is to grow this social movement so that people who are working to further equalities practice have access to each other, they have a place where they're challenged to do better, and they have a place to access best practice and opportunities to create and document change, including what works, and more importantly, what doesn't work. So I'd like to thank people who've signed up initially, because they are our early adopters, but I also want to encourage people to join. This is not going to be a passive movement, and this is not going to be a movement without challenge. So when you do join, and if you do join, be prepared to join and to show up. I'm also very grateful to people who have agreed to be part of it, like Robert and like our sheriffs, who we're going to introduce in a minute, because they're going to uphold the new law in this equalities land. And I'm really pleased that they're prepared to be part of this movement and be part of making the movement what it is. A friend of mine shared with me a quote, which I think actually sums up what lies at the heart of BRAP's work, but is really very importantly relevant, I think, for what we're trying to create with the Equalities Republic. And it's a quote from James Baldwin, and he says, "The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. The place where I'll fit will not exist until I make it." So that's what we're doing, folks, today. We're making a place where the practice, the work that we do, is a better fit for the society that we want to create. Thank you. Back over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Joy. Right, every republic has its sheriffs, the people who lay down the law. And we're going to kick off by hearing from our 4 sheriffs. And the question we've asked them to address is this: if you could consign 1 or 2 things to the dustbin of history, and that's equalities history, what would they be? What should be outlawed in the Equality Republic? And to answer this question, we have, first of all, Doyin Atawelogun. She is a chartered organisational psychologist, one of the UK's foremost experts on organisational development, diversity, intersectionality and leadership. She's a scholar, practitioner, a regular contributor to the media, and an award-winning academic who's received awards for her innovative methodologies for working with different organisations. She's currently Dean of the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford University, and concurrently she is Director of Delta Alpha Phi, a niche leadership and inclusion consultancy. It's quite a mouthful to get through there. So Doyin is going to kick off, and you're going to tell us, first of all, what you believe should be consigned to the rubbish bin of equalities.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Robert. And thank you again, Joy, for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation and in particular be a sheriff. So this morning, I have 2 things that I would like us to kind of consign to history in the Equality Republic. The first is ditching single issue items such as race, I'm going to come back to that. The second thing is ditching common practice as an expression. We need to stop doing that and look for evidence-based practice. So I'll go to the first one, ditching single issue items. Many people, I think, on this call would be familiar with the Audre Lorde's phrase. It's often repeated: we cannot deal with single issue items because we did not live single issue lives. So one of the things that we should do by way of just everyday expression in this work is to adopt intersectional thinking. What is intersectionality? Again, many people on this call will be familiar with it. Over the last couple of months, it's become a lot more prevalent in terms of just kind of general conversations with regards to diversity and inclusion. But intersectionality, very simply, is thinking or framing that assumes that any single identity is influenced by other identities. So you, for example, see me as a woman who is always Black. I cannot separate my gender from my ethnicity. This is important because the more we think through how to advance equalities for different people in organizations, in society, the better our solutions get, the more we think through intersecting identities. For example, working with a law firm recently, and the law firm talks about how they need to advance ethnicity from the perspective of retaining BAME, and I use that bearing in mind the debates around the problematic use of the term. So, but bearing in mind BAME underrepresentation, issues with BAME retention, issues with BAME progression. When we look more deeply into their data, we find actually that in that particular organization, Black women are leaving soon after qualification and Asian men are becoming partners. The minute we deep dive into the data at that level, it raises a different type of solution or initiative or levers for change. One of the things we absolutely need to do is look at the data that we have and evaluate it using an intersectional lens. So right now, I'm not saying gather more data, feel free to do that. Not saying go out and do more work. Saying based on the information that we have in our various organizations, let's think through the extent to which we can unpick it further by adding different layers of identities to see whether we can see the patterns more clearly. I also asked the people who belong to networks who are kind of signing up this morning and are contributing to this conversation, have a think about how your employee resource groups can also think through intersectionally. So invite your members to talk about how their other identities make their experiences different from the norm. Find ways to tell stories of variety within that group. So explore how, for example, in your women's network, how religious status or sexual orientation makes the women's experiences within your organization differ. So that's number one, ditch single issue items and adopt intersectionality. The second thing I would like to go with, like I said, is ditching the expression common practice. We need to stop doing that. We need to stop doing stuff because other people are doing it. Research extensively shows that just because other people do it, and we know this as well, doesn't mean it is right. And I just want to ask our listeners two questions as an example. Can I ask you, if we think based on the evidence available, which is more important in predicting employees' performance? In your view, is it being conscientious or is it being intelligent? Which of those is more important? When you go out and ask people that question, often they pick the wrong answer. Yes, conscientiousness and IQ are both important predictors of performance, but actually intelligence is relatively more important. Intelligence contributes to 25% of the variation in performance, whereas conscientiousness contributes to 9%, 25% versus 9%. So this is one of those things that generally people say, well, they're actually about the same, or you know what, it's more important to work hard. And this is particularly important for jobs increasing in complexity. Intelligence becomes more and more important. Again, lots of debate with regards to how we measure intelligence, but based on the evidence that's available, these are the findings. A second question is, which is more effective for improving team performance? In your view, is it collaborative decision-making, or is it setting performance goals? Which is more effective for team performance, working in collaboration or having goals? Research suggests that goal setting improves performance by 16%. This is compared to 1% for collaborative decision-making. This is because when you have collaborative decision-making, there are pros and cons. So it's kind of, it depends on how it's managed. So broadly speaking, goal setting improves performance. And these are two things that people generally get wrong when you look at the evidence. So ditch common practice because everybody else is doing it. Look for evidence-based practice. And there are many methods and processes for doing that, which I'm happy to refer to later on. Thank you very much, Robert. That's me out.
Thank you, Doyen. Well, that's quite an impressive start. Ditching single issue approaches, getting rid of common practice, looking for an intelligence-based approach, affirming intersectionality. So that's part of the new republic. Well, let's press on and see what our second sheriff has to add to the mix. Our second sheriff is Roger Klein. Roger is, hold on, I'm going a bit too, yes, it is Roger Klein. Roger is a research fellow at Middlesex University Business School. He has extensive knowledge and experience of workplace culture, primarily in the public sector. He was a trade union official working for 8 different unions. I'm not sure what that's all about in terms of crisscrossing across the unions. You may want to tell me about that later on, Roger. He's currently part-time inclusion advisor to the National NHS Talent Management Programme with Doyen Atawalagon. Over to you, Roger.
Good morning, and perhaps first to say I'm really pleased to be invited. BRAP is a really ace organisation. So first in my bin, I've got 3 things to chuck in the bin. First in the bin is relying on interventions that purport to improve equality, diversity and inclusion, but where those proposing them, interventions, are unable to provide any evidence they might work. And I could give a whole list of things, but if I just give 3 examples: an overemphasis on diversity training, despite the overwhelming evidence that it may be useful, but it's of relatively limited use. Token members on disciplinary panels. This is a real bête noire for me. Organisations whose practices are poor think that somehow they can redress poor practice on discipline by sticking a token member, usually a BME person, because it's BME staff who are disproportionately disciplined in most organisations, putting a BME person on a disciplinary panel, when the real issue is not how fair the disciplinary hearing is, but why such people are in the disciplinary process in the first place. Too many people enter disciplinary processes. BME people particularly enter them. We should be asking why rather than sticking a token person on a panel. Same argument to some degree applies to interview panels. And thirdly, third thing that is an intervention that I think we have to be really cautious about: positive action. It can be really helpful and can be really good for people, but not if it's an alternative to tackling the institutional obstacles that prevent people with protected characteristics from developing their talent and being appreciated within the organisation. So that's the first thing in the bin. The second thing in the bin will be And I think we've really seen this over COVID-19 in the health service and probably in other organizations. Organizations that they're committed to real change on EDI, but where board members just can't explain to staff, managers, and indeed to interview panels why tackling discrimination is important and can demonstrate what they are personally doing to achieve this. Why is this important? We know that what leaders do and say decisively affects the culture of an organization, including on diversity and inclusion. We know that diversity and inclusion are crucial for effective leadership, improving creativity, innovation, risk awareness, productivity, turnover, staff engagement, a whole heap of things. It's crucial for the organization. And we should really stop appointing leaders who, for example, during COVID-19 in the health service, when staff and indeed regulators demand attention be paid to why 200 NHS staff, disproportionately BME staff, died, and then suggest that this scandal becomes a priority. Some people then suggest we should be careful not to just prioritize just this one issue. When a house is burning, you pay attention to that house. It doesn't mean you're not paying attention to other houses overall. But when the situation at the moment in COVID-19 in the health service, it's very clear, disproportionately BME staff have been infected and dying. That should be a priority for organizations. If they can't, board members can't see that, then they shouldn't be there. And finally, in the bin, organizations that have KPIs and targets around a whole range of issues, but cannot demonstrate effective accountability on them. I can't remember how many failed action plans I've been asked to look at that reappear every year with a few tweaks, but no consequences of the fact that they didn't really move the dial the previous year. I wonder how many trusts there are where the chair or the chief executive refuses to agree an action plan on the grounds it wouldn't work. I actually heard of one recently, not quite a first, but it cheered me up a bit. And finally, how many trusts with poor data, particularly on race, have received good or outstanding ratings in their CQC inspections? And I'm not suggesting we go around beating managers up if they don't hit their targets. I think if there's a risk sometimes with targets, you know the old saying, you can hit the target, miss the point. But actually, unless there is accountability central to trying to improve equality, diversity, inclusion, actually we end up with very little progress. And the lack of internal or external scrutiny, I think, is a real problem. So my bin has got 3 things in it, Robert.
Thank you. That was an abrupt end. I was expecting a little bit more from you there at the end in terms of summarising up, but that's fantastic. So look, we've got 5 things in the bin so far, and we've got a good sense of where this new republic is taking us. And thank you for that, Roger, because it's quite clear that both of you have underlined the importance of evidence-based work, the dangers of tokenism, the way in which there is a disconnect between what is said and what is actually done, the place of genuine practice, genuine goals, and accountability, all of which I think to most people would seem normal and natural and a good way in which you run business. So it's quite shocking that these things aren't central and important for race equality, but it's good. The good news is that they are a part of the equality republic that we're building at this point in time. We're going to go into our 3rd speaker for this morning, Carol Campaign. Carol is Executive Director of the Diversity Practice, a faculty member of the NHS Leadership Academy, creator of Borderless Coaching, and an architect of different women, different places, with a reputation for delivering prominent diversity, inclusion and programming across the public and private sectors. She's established an international reputation for leadership, development, diversity, inclusion, and organizational change. Carol, it's a pleasure to have you on the Equality Republic this morning.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Robert. And thank you so much, Brad. I've waited a long time to be part of this movement, so I'm absolutely thrilled and excited. You know, the question was, what should we throw into the dustbin of history? And my problem with that is that history has a nasty way of repeating itself. So there's something about history that needs to completely disappear. People are talking about a new normal, and I refuse to use that term because normal has never worked, has not worked. Certainly if we talk about Black, Asian, or ethnically diverse people, it just hasn't worked. So I think there's something about history that must not return, and something that's really important about us recognizing that it's not about a new normal, but a new tomorrow. But to the point as to specifically what I would like to throw in this dustbin, the first thing would be the infrastructure. The infrastructure that supports diversity and inclusion in organizations is just not fit for purpose. It's absolutely ridiculous to accept, and I think Joy spoke to this earlier on, that one person should be responsible for every single function of a very large organization, be that, you know, professional services or law or the NHS and NHS trust. That's absolutely impossible. And so that infrastructure for me needs to be thrown away and completely reset. And when I say that, I'm also thinking about from the EDI leads, some of whom, many of whom, if we take the NHS, are on, they're band 5s. They have very limited influence and very limited power. In addition to that, the focus in a lot of organizations in that infrastructure is on process. Process never delivers an outcome. So if we take things like the equality delivery system, another example within the NHS, to an extent, although well-intended, we can end up just simply ticking the box. Equally, when we look at D&I leads, coming back to that, I absolutely think that if you've done HR, that's great. But if we really are looking at systemic change, people who have those responsibilities should also be equipped to deliver transformational change. So it's not enough to have a passion for diversity and inclusion. As we can see, it's too important. We have seen people die. You know, we're coming through, actually, are we coming through? We're still in the middle of, if we look at the US, the COVID pandemic, we see the disproportionate impact that that has had on those marginalized in society. So from that particular point of view, it really is important that people who have this responsibility really are equipped to bring about this systemic change. And that speaks to governance. I absolutely think that when it comes to those, whether they are on boards whether they're on boards in terms of trustees or non-executive directors, whatever their role or title, again, if they've not done the work and can evidence that, and I mean really evidence that before I applied to be on this board, here's the change that I have made historically, and I've done my own personal transformation, reprogramming, worked through that stuff for myself as a leader. I know what equality and inclusion looks like across a range of issues, and I've been accountable for it. They should not be appointed. That really is important for me. I think we put up with kind of too much. I mean, when I look at some of the boards and the resumes, they're very impressive from the perspective of, you know, transactional delivery and so on and so forth. But when it comes to really demonstrating what they've done in this space of diversity and inclusion, they're not even asked the question. So that whole infrastructure for me is just not fit for purpose. And the other thing, I think I'm just going to pick on, you know, jump on Roger's back, so to speak, when it comes to rewards. Why are we rewarding? And I think we kind of come into this performative culture across the piece where we have these large events where we are awarding organizations for achieving nothing when it comes to race. Absolutely nothing. We get dressed up and off we go, and a variety of different organizations take the stage and they are congratulated on the outcome that we now have today. And I think that should be completely chucked away. I think that organizations who really demonstrate consistently over time absolutely. But those that haven't, I'm sorry, they should not be there at all. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't award. So for example, I do know that if we, there are many examples where we are actually acknowledging Black, Asian, and other minorities who have succeeded. I think that's great. Need to change the language there. I think that's important. But those other rewards, please, can we get rid of them? So those are the kind of 2.5, maybe 3 things that I would chuck into the Never Never Land. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much, Carol. Again, a fantastic set of issues to contend with. The whole idea that the infrastructure must go, well, that blows everything up. That is truly Republican. We are starting all over again in this culture of rewarding failure. I mean, it's very, very British in many respects, isn't it? You know, so again, it's a new republic, something that needs to be completely reconsidered. We're going to move on to our final speaker for this first session. It's Richard Hillier. Richard is a chartered psychologist at Coventry University. His research focuses on the ethnic disparity of attainment within higher education, specifically how institutional practice and policy can disadvantage particular students. When not engaged in analysis, he enjoys walking his dog and spending time with his 2 daughters. I think he's still a Coventry City fan. So I think that may work in there somewhere as well. But over to you, Richard. What would you like to ditch in consigned to history for our new equality republic?
Thank you, Robert. And thank you very much to BRAP for this invite, and good morning to everybody. And I'm not a Coventry City fan, by the way, as a Geordie. Let me just say that. Okay, so when I was asked what I would consign to history, I was tempted to say formal education in its entirety, certainly in its current form. This might seem quite extreme, but I believe the current system simply isn't working. Or to be more precise, education is working for some a lot more than others. Indeed, only this month, a parliamentary group said, and I quote, "There was entrenched inequality which exists within the education system." Before detailing my position, I think it's right to define what I believe education should be. To me, education should be a key, if not the key, driver for social change. Education should humanize society, ensuring every individual, irrespective of background or characteristic, has the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Without this opportunity, we simply risk replicating what we already have: societal inequality based on ethnicity, social class, gender, and privilege. In fact, formal education actually risks being a barrier in the pursuit of a just and fair society. Instead of leveling the playing field, educational institutions simply risk replicating the inequalities that are so evident today. So I work at Coventry University, where the attainment gap between white students and black students is around about 12%. The university sector average is around 16%, depending which methodology is adopted. So if we have a class of 100 students, 50 white students and 50 black students, 40 of the white students will be attain a first or a second class degree, compared to 34 of their black peers. Coventry University has over 30,000 students, of which more than half self-categorize as BME. The numbers and the waste of human talent is both terrifying and depressing. Perhaps the most depressing fact is the cause of disparity of attainment. We know there is a difference when comparing social class between our students. We know that our black students are far more likely to enter university with a BTEC qualification rather than A-levels. We know that BME students are more likely to commute from home while their white peers live on campus. But the simple reality is attainment disparity reflects a series of institutional failures rather than an individual one. And that leads me to something that really should be consigned to the bin: the continuing belief and positioning that failure is a reflection of an individual personal deficit. The continued focus of blame on the individual is inexcusable. Research has consistently demonstrated that students who enter university with more traditional qualifications, such as A-levels, are far more likely to achieve a higher degree award than those who come with a BTEC. Yet when I'm talking to BME students, a common theme is evident. If asked, why did you do a BTEC, they frequently reply, well, the teacher said it fitted my learning style, or it was best for me. I don't believe that. I believe that reflects a legacy of inequality within the education system prior to university, a positioning where our most disadvantaged are further disadvantaged through individual and institutional bias. But irrespective of previous academic experience, universities have a moral obligation to ensure a level playing field. And with regards to that, universities collectively continue to fail. Despite spending millions of pounds, interventions are frequently no more than tick box exercises. And that's something else I like to ban. Token or tick box interventions. Ethnic attainment disparity has been discussed for over 60 years, and we have to ask a simple question. If it was white students who were institutionally disadvantaged, would progress or change really have been so slow? Would we still be talking about it after so many years? And the honest answer is, I severely doubt it. So let's get rid of tick box interventions. Let's get rid of individual deficit theory, and let's hold all institutions, whatever they are, to account. The reality is institutions, whether it be universities, colleges, the police, or any other, validate white people and whiteness automatically, expecting individuals labeled as BME to prove themselves, either confirming their worst expectations or being surprised when they manage to exceed them. I think that we have to decide as a society how we want to live, what sort of future do we want, what do we want for ourselves, and more importantly, what do we want for generations to come. And I strongly believe that we all have a duty in determining that. And that's why we cannot and we shouldn't continue to tolerate business as usual. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Again, a radical tearing up of the rule book, getting rid of formal, not getting rid of formal, completely reconfiguring formal education, challenging some of the ways in which the target-based approach has been insufficient and inadequate to deliver in higher education. And I presume some of these categories work in terms of primary and secondary education as well, although the contexts are different. We've now had our panelists provide us with the things that they'd like to consign to the past and what they'd like to see in the new republic. It's now an opportunity for you to provide us with some reflections on what's been said so far. I should have directed you earlier on to the, I think I mentioned it, I should have reinforced it, that if you do have questions, just put it in the chat and we can direct them to our panelists throughout the morning. Asif, at this point, is going to provide us with a summary of some of the responses so far.
Hello, thank you very much. Just to say, you can also use the Q&A function if you need to for questions as well, which is great. 3 big points coming out. First one, a couple of questions from Ella Patak-Sen and Jennifer Moses about intersectionality in response to Doyen's talk. One of these questions was, one of the risks with taking an intersectional approach is that organisations can hide behind the bit of equality that they find comfortable and refuse to face systemic racism. So how can we address that? How can we ensure, for example, that the connections between sexism and racism are talked about more fluently and we're more comfortable with that? So that's one question, intersectionality. Another point, a number of people saying these ditchable points are really useful, but what do we need to go forward? What do we need for the future? And we've mentioned we're going to cover that later in the session, but particularly on Rogers and Richard's points about targets and accountability. How do we make organisations more accountable for progress on equality? What can we do to achieve that? And then a last point from Ella Clark about BME leadership programs. So she was talking about how she's averse to BME leadership programs, as she's not sure how many white counterparts might need the same before they're ready for management too. What are your views as panelists? So 3 broad points coming out there. Thanks for all your questions. Keep them coming.
Thank you, Asif. Well, Doyen, let's take that first question. The problem with intersectionality is that sometimes the science of it and these multiple intersections can obfuscate core issues like racial inequality. How do you respond to that?
Thank you, Robert. Immediate reaction is if someone is doing that, what you're saying, that they're not doing intersectionality. So if people are using intersectionality to hide behind where the issue is, then it's not intersectionality, because intersectionality absolutely spotlights the combination of the identities for where the problem is. So it looks at what the power hierarchy is or what the power differentials are. But I understand, just trying to kind of take a step back and kind of think through the question. if you are truly intersectional, right? So if you're like, actually, we want to target sexism in our organizations, and one suspects, you know, as a side note, you suspect that actually they're focusing on gender because they don't want to focus on race. A truly intersectional approach that focuses on sexism will identify how race influences sexist experiences or experiences of sexism. So you can go or you know, kind of start or lead with a particular identity dimension. It's not about silos and say, you know, we'll do this and then we'll do this next and then we'll do this next. It's saying this thing that we want to look at, how are other dimensions influencing that thing? So I hope I've answered that. I've also answered, responded to the.
I think what the question is trying to get at, and maybe you could just touch on this briefly, is that there's a certain comfortableness, and we've seen this, of addressing, for example, the intersection of sexuality and class, and less comfortable looking at maybe race and gender. And I think it's how to ensure that the uncomfortable questions and intersections are foregrounded, rather than just allowing the more, you know, the ones that we feel more comfortable with to be foregrounded. I mean, do you have something to say to that?
Thank you, Robert. So I would say if we're focusing on class and sexual orientation, that within the group that we are focusing, right, on that group, their experiences will differ. It's likely to differ by ethnicity and gender. So if it's a truly intersectional analysis, just looking at that group and looking at what the differences are will bring the issues to the fore.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, a couple of questions now for Roger and Richard. Roger, the question of, well, what's the alternative? You know, if you do decide to focus on this evidence-based approach that you mentioned, if you're looking for the demonstration of the connection between what's said and what's done and accountability, well, you've consigned these things to the past, but what do you envisage as being the way forward?
Okay, so 2 or 3 things. I think the first thing is stop dealing with discrimination as a matter of individual, leaving it to individuals to raise their concerns. If you look at the kind of HR paradigm, we need to turn it upside down. At the moment, if you have a problem, the organizations say we've got procedures to deal with it. Policies, procedures, training. It should be the other way around. The organization should take responsibility for tackling equality and diversity and concerns around them, listening to lived experience, but the organization going out and looking for those problems rather than waiting for individuals to have the courage or to be sufficiently foolish to raise their heads above the parapet. So that's the first thing. The paradigm needs to be turned upside down. I think the second thing is that there's very strong evidence that organizations that treat equality, diversity, and inclusion as a source of improvement rather than as a matter of compliance, as something around governance rather than being dumped on a band 5 or a band 6 EDI lead, as Carol said, do much better. There's lots of evidence that doing things right in the EDI space improves the sort of services you provide, the treatment of staff, the organizational effectiveness. And I suppose, which is the trickiest thing we have to think about, is how do we measure that, and perhaps touch on that towards the end, Robert. But I think we do know some of the ways in which we can measure progress, staff surveys, turnover data, etc., etc. We need to think quite carefully through how we measure inclusion, not just representativeness. So, but I would start with the paradigm. The current one, which is start with the individual and see if they've got the kind of courage to raise concerns, is absolutely busted. Turn it upside down, make the organization responsible for looking for issues in the same way you would expect them to do it around health and safety, for example.
And accountability?
Well, I think that I think it's quite clear. Organizational leaders that fail to address something that the evidence says makes a big difference to how good their organization is. I know the health service best. It's quite clear. Those organizations, there's loads of data now on this, those organizations that are better at these issues provide better and safer services. If they can't do that, they either have to be helped to change, and if they can't or they won't change, it's time to move on. So I'm not in favor of beating managers up. I'm in favor of, if you like, a kind of explain or comply approach. But at the end of the day, if you can't change, then make way for somebody who can do something that's self-evidently in the best interests of patients.
Thank you. I know we're going to be looking at this later on in more detail, but just if you want to flag up a couple of things, Richard, that you think are pointers for the way forward, and also deal with this question of accountability.
I fully agree with Roger. I do believe there has to be a paradigm shift away from the individual back to the institution. Roger says that he doesn't want to beat managers. I don't want to beat them, don't get me wrong, but there has to be accountability, I think, within, especially within higher education. You know, we live in a marketized situation. You see loads of banners, the best university of this, the best university of that. You know, how would I create accountability? I'll publicize. As I said in my talk, you know, if this disparity of attainment, which can be traced back to 1960 for the Coleman Report, 2010 for the UK HIs, if this was the other way around, I firmly believe if ethnicity is a standalone, and I fully agree, by the way, about intersectionality, but as a standalone variable, if that was significant to attainment and therefore social progression, if it was the other way around, I'm sure it would have been addressed far, far sooner. And people hide behind either interventions or just trying to fluster and bluster with policy documents that never adhere to.
So you'd like to see universities, for example, have on their website their success in closing the attainment gap, the diversification of their staff, all the metrics should be included as some kind of, doesn't it already happen in terms of some kind of race award?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the race award, but certainly the metrics are publicized. But if you look at across the institutions, everybody has a different way of presenting the data. And there's a variety of way of cutting the data. So there has to be a consistency. So we actually understand and compare like for like. And again, I think that's just the transparency of what we need for real change.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more, Asif, before we take our break. We're scheduled to take our break at 5:02. So we've got a few more minutes to take maybe one or two more questions.
Great. So one question which I asked before, I don't think you had a chance to answer, maybe for Carol, is around Ella Clark saying, I'm averse to BME leadership programs, as I'm not sure how many white counterparts need the same before they're ready for management. What are your views? Then another question, lots of interest in Richard's talk about education. So one from Rachel Musson, addressing the legacy of inequalities in our system needs to start with decolonising education systems. How should we approach educational reform moving forward?
Well, that's a big one. We may need to tackle that second one in the second part, but we'll try and flag up a pathway for the way forward. But Carol, would you like to take that first question about the problem with diversity courses and campaigns that target BME, for want of a better word, staff members?
I mean, I think that where BME programs, leadership development programs target, and in terms of their overall curriculum content, focus on the deficit, which is you're on this program because there's something broken that needs to be fixed, is another thing that I would absolutely throw in the dustbin. I do think that there is a place, certainly, for Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse leaders to congregate, to come together, to be absolutely reminded of the value that they bring to their organizations. It's one of these things that is completely ignored, it's completely undermined. For me as a Black woman, I remember kind of working in higher education where I've worked for many, many years, kind of going into that organization. And I had to be able to look at things from multiple different perspectives. I had to be and I still have to be culturally competent. I had to grow into my leadership very, very quickly, my leadership of self, being really self-aware, being responsive to what was going on, being politically savvy. These are natural leadership capabilities that I firmly believe Black, Asian, ethnically diverse leaders have. And for me, programs that build on that and move away from the deficit, problem, issue base to the value base that are really about enhancing the leadership skills and capabilities of those leaders I think is a must. There has to be a place where we come together to remind ourselves and to grow and to develop. And if that's what those programs are about, absolutely. And at the same time, they cannot be done in isolation. So there's no point in running a program for BAME leaders and completely ignoring the power base and the majority environment that they go back into. Those two things must run in absolute parallel. So for me, it's kind of both and.
Thank you. And Richard, decolonization.
Okay, so we talked about the paradigm shift from the individual to the institution. Regarding curriculum change, I think you need a paradigm shift the other way. I have huge reservation about predominantly white academics formulating a curriculum that they perceive as being diverse. Actually, where's the student voice in there?
Yeah.
We have to be so careful. And I think, interventions can be done, whether it's in the best of faith or not, to improve the situation, but can then serve to actually further disadvantage, alienate, and reduce institutional belonging. That's my concern about that.
Fantastic. Well, we're doing incredibly well for time. I'm not sure what's happening this morning. We're about 3 minutes ahead of time. So I think we've got time for one more, Asif, one quick response, and then we'll take our break.
Roger, can I pop back in as well, if that's okay? Robert, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'll pop back in after the question.
Sure. Asif.
Okay, great. So we've got a question here from Danielle Oom. Do the panelists feel that this advanced EDI thinking, high concept, revolutionary discussion is immediately applicable to organisations that are at remedial level? Or would they advocate a working up to this? Is it revolution or is it evolution?
Would somebody like to take that one?
Kind of very quickly, I don't know how many more years we have for evolution. So from that point of view, I definitely think it's revolution. No doubt about it. It's now or never, really.
Thank you. To all of our panelists this morning. We're just warming up. We'll see you all again a little bit later on. But before we take our break, I'm going to hand back over to Joy Warmington at Brad.
Okay, thanks for that. And it's great to see so many questions coming in. I think that it has to be about revolution. I think we're very used to seeing failure in this agenda. We've got used to seeing failure, and we've got used to reporting failure. And we've got very, very used to putting failure back in the hands of people who are most affected by the failure to come up with some of what we need to do. So I think there's a way of thinking that we need to change. I think our belief systems around this agenda definitely need to be reawakened. And without moving back into the intersectionality race agenda, I do honestly believe there is something about race. We can't talk about it. We do try to disguise it. We try to hide it. It's what else it's the stuff that we put in the way that prevents us, I think, from taking this agenda seriously. So I think there needs to be much more investment in people's understanding of it, people's comfortableness about it, but also, and I think this is really critical, white people are racialized differently, but nevertheless, they are part of the human race too. So we definitely need to find ways to get more white people understanding this and being okay with this agenda and speaking up in intelligent ways. So ways that don't mean that they just do some tokenistic things and say, oh, well, let's stick a BME person on the panel, that will fix it. So definite revolution, folks.
Thank you. Well, we're sticking to the schedule, and it's now 5 to 11. So we're going to take a break for 5 minutes and then come back at 11 o'clock when we're going to hear from 3 respondents to our panelists. I hope that you're enjoying what we're saying about the Equality Republic. It's a revolutionary space. It calls for unprecedented thinking and new challenges, new approaches to the challenges that we face. So we're going to sign off now, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. There should be a countdown.
Don't sign out, folks. Just
don't sign out.
Yeah,
no,
don't sign out. Just stay where you are.
Stay where you are. But there should be a digital counter, I think, so counting this down for the next 5 minutes. Is that right?
Thanks, Robert.
And we really need something fundamental that's going to make a massive change to how we move the equalities agenda forward. I'm just going to kind of take myself through some of the things I heard this morning. I think, Doyen, you mentioned the whole issue around intersectionality, and not that we want to go back to that. I think what you said was fantastic, but I personally don't think you went far enough, because I still think, I know there's a major issue about talking about race. I'm a member of staff at Sheffield Hallam, and I think there's so much more that needs to be done. We don't seem to be able to have that conversation, to find the language that we need to use, to find a space that is comfortable. Intersectionality is really, really important, but as has happened in the years, we had multiculturalism, we had racism, we had EDI, and what happens, we keep forgetting about race as we go along on the agenda. So I personally still think, although what you said was fantastic, I still think we need to have a conversation about race, and that's what's not happening. But I thought the rest of the things you said was absolutely fantastic. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the whole idea about data and how you use data for evidence. The issue that we have is often the data is presented. Sheffield Hallam, 30% degree awarding gap. I think Roger mentioned something like 12% at Coventry. Ours is 30%. It actually went up by another percentage. So where is the data coming from? Why are we not believing the data? And why we're not using the data then to do something? I'm hearing that staff are saying, oh, there's an issue with the data. So if you're saying an evidence-based approach and a data approach, how can we convince people that there is some truth behind the data? And then Roger, I think there was some really fantastic things there. Again, I fundamentally feel that many members of staff were working in EDI, etc. They are the gatekeepers. Unfortunately, I think they're put in positions whereby they don't have the power to make any changes. You're right, I think relying on interventions that say we can improve things is not good enough. I think most of what you said, I actually agreed with. You said to stop dealing with discrimination as an individual. What we need is an organizational approach, and we need senior leaders, I think, to move and to come out and be brave and to say, we're going to do something about this. It's not an individual thing, it's an organizational approach. We have to look at structures. I fundamentally feel that we need a grenade, actually, a massive grenade that actually just blows up the whole structure. It needs to, yeah, we need a grenade, you know, that just blows it all up, and we actually start from scratch and we start coming together and saying, let's look at how we can unravel and unpick this and do something together. So again, lots of really good things there, but again, I think we can be more revolutionary, you know, and we can really move forward. Carol, I thought, said some really great things there, and I fundamentally agree with you, Carol. History has a way of repeating itself. And I'm like, we've been having this conversation for 400 years. They've had their knees on our neck for 400 years. So not sure we can really take our time. So need to look at infrastructure, absolutely. What is it that's supporting the issues within our organizations? Really, we've had things like Athena Swan, we've had race equality charters. So how do you award an organization for positivity around EDI when you've got a 30% BME attainment gap? Why have we got Athena Swan? Why have we got race equality charters? I don't understand. So agree, those things have got to go. Ditch them completely. Why are we, as Robert said, why are we rewarding failure? Why have I got a charter mark? And actually, Black students actually coming in with A-levels as well as BTEC, but they're still leaving the university with less of a degree. So they're not all coming in with BTEC, some are coming in with A-levels and actually still coming out with a less of a degree. So something fundamentally is not working. Richard, again, I think some fantastic things there. I work in a university, so I know there are fundamental issues. But how do we support staff and work with staff to actually look at the curriculum, look at what you're delivering, try to understand why BME students are not thriving and are not progressing? I think there is something there about how we come together to find a language where we can start to have a conversation to actually move the agenda forward. So really, I do think that everything the sheriffs have said, I think there's some fantastic things there, but I do fundamentally think that this is a revolution now, and we're going to really have to gird our loins and go a lot further than we might be anticipating.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We're going to press on with our second respondent. It's Yvonne Field, a long-time activist, successful entrepreneur, former central government and women's enterprise advisor. 40 years experience of working at all levels with groups and individuals from grassroots community organizations to local and national government. She established the Ubeli initiative in 2014. It's a unique national African diaspora-led social enterprise which develops community spaces and supports intergenerational leadership development, community enterprise, and social change. Good morning, Yvonne.
Good morning, Robert, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Joy, for inviting me to join this really inspiring and challenging conversation this morning. Okay, my response to what I've heard so far, there were some moments during the last hour where my stomach kind of churned. Just kind of, I got moments at certain points, partly because, yeah, you know, this conversation around equality, and particularly I'm centering on race and equality for this conversation, has been a sort of, has raised and stretched, you know, sort of spaces and places and people's thinking and emotions over the last several hundred years, as Jennifer mentioned, but certainly in the last 50 years or so in the UK. I want to pick up on maybe just one point that each of our presenters have made, and just to comment on those during the time that I've got. And I'm particularly focusing on the community perspective in relation to those issues, partly because Ubeli works with communities from grassroots through to sort of national organizations, but also because I feel that kind of bits have been a little bit missing. It's been very institutional and very academic. I also teach at Goldsmiths 2 days a week, and I want to talk a little bit about that in relation to what Richard was saying about higher education. Okay, so Dwayne, you mentioned common practice and challenged the notion of common practice. And although I was struck by some of the evidence you presented about, you know, what we understand around that, I'm kind of, the question I suppose I have around challenging the notion of common practice is in relation to evidence-based practice, yes. I'm kind of struck by, when working in communities, how the evidence base for what's effective ways of facilitating and organizing communities is in academia and has very little to do what happens on the ground. And that cuts across whichever service it is, whether it's health service, education system, or whatever. And I think that we need a much stronger alignment between evidence-based practice and how that informs and the practical application of what we know works in real people's lives, and that we don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. We can build on what we know, but actually that we need to ensure that the practice, particularly practice, evidence-based practice that Black people in all sectors have generated in academia, but also in the field, how that is disseminated and embedded in communities so that people benefit from the knowledge, and it's a sustained benefit. It's not just something because you get 2 years funding to do, that's best practice now and then something else changes. So I think that there's a real challenge both for academics and academia, as well as, because you know, we, and I have to include myself because I'm an academic part-time as well, we hold some golden nuggets and we are guardians of those nuggets. And I think we need to find ways to ensure that we share those nuggets in a way that's accessible. That, you know, in a way that, you know, if we talk about intersectionality, what does that mean to a Black woman who's experiencing domestic violence on a housing estate, you know, et cetera, et cetera? What does this actually mean? So those are some things around common practice. Roger, just one little bit I'm going to pick up from all of the points that you made, and that's linking really to equality, diversity, inclusion training, learning and development opportunities. I've been part of the system because I've been, you know, working as a consultant, all the organizational development stuff I did from the mid-90s onwards. So I have benefited from facilitating those kinds of programs. And I think that we need to just, I agree, we need to get, I believe, and I love the whole revolutionary space that I'm in this morning. So this is a great way to spend a Monday, one of the best ways, a good kickstart to the week. But I believe that those programs, from, you know, equality, diversity, to unconscious bias, to all the things that actually allow us to skirt around the issues, they need to go. And I actually do believe, maybe because I'm old school as well, been around a long time, in positive action, not, as you said, as a reaction to or as a replacement for people who are in organizations, but positive action has opened up and created pathways for people who would not necessarily have the opportunity to get into professions, to get into university, to get access to the system, and, you know, and to kind of make their ways through it. I believe that we need a radical rethink of those kinds of entry points, but we do need really entry points to create a level playing field, because it's not level, basically, we know that. In terms of the whole issue around institutions, and what Carol was saying around dismantling infrastructure, I wondered, what opportunities do we have right now? I totally agree with it. I agree that we should hold these senior board members to account. And if we're able to, then the issue is, what would those boards look like? Yeah, they would not be those snowy white peaks. If you're saying, what exactly have you done? Don't just put it on your CV, some sort of bland statement. Tell us. Let's get evidence from people around you that you say you've impacted. Let's listen to their stories about how they've experienced you. So I believe, yeah, I totally agree that we need to dismantle the infrastructure. And at the moment, we are at a, you know, Kairos moment. I think that there is a lot of, and I'm going to just name it, white guilt, white shame, some white anger, white allies at this moment in time. And I'm really heartened to see the young people just going for it and actually just, you know, prepared to be out there and just to push the boundaries together. And so I think that there's an opportunity for that kind of dialogue, just to say what you've been thinking for the past 15 years within those organizations, and be prepared to maybe sit in silence if necessary, but actually to really challenge those board members, those senior managers around, you know, so tell us what your evidence, give us your evidence, let's look at it. Let's be your critique, you know, and for the work that you've done. And the last point I wanted to make is in relation to Roger and academia. What a place. I'm just about to leave it after 6 years this time round. I was there for 4 years in the 1990s. You know, I'm at Goldsmiths, which is seen to be quite a sort of progressive kind of, you know, hippy-dippy kind of place. At least it was in the 60s and 70s. It's still got that arty kind of notion because of where it's located and the kind of programs. And the students on my course, which is community development and youth work, is 80% BME, 85% BME. It's seen as a black course. It had over 100 hours of a 300-hour course cut 5 years ago. The students fought it, and last week are getting several hundreds of thousands of pounds, more than £750,000 going to be awarded to them for the disproportionate treatment that they've had in relation to that programme. And last year, not this academic year, because I'm not quite sure of the results, but last year we got 7 first-class degrees and something like 70% 2-1s, off the scale, right? But actually, we know who we recruit, we know what we provide, and we've had to fight the system alongside the students to make sure the course survives and that the students can thrive. And the staff do it in addition to their day job, the students do it in addition to their learning, making sure that that program survives. So I think that, you know, the universities have a long way to go. I agree with the whole notion of it being a key driver for social change. And I think we need to be in there and we need to continue to challenge.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much for very comprehensive analysis, response to our panelists. We've got our final respondent before we go into a full plenary to try and pull together some of the themes and think about the way forward. It's Alex Moore-Morris, currently an MA student at the University of Birmingham and a consultant working on various equality initiatives at London Metropolitan University. Alex has over 7 years experience with higher education equality initiatives. He was nominated as one of Bristol's most 100 influential BME people in 2018 and was part of a team that received the Guardian Higher Education Award for Retention Support and Student Outcomes. Alex, it's a pleasure to have you on the Equality Republic this morning.
Thank you. And yeah, just to echo what everyone else has said, a big to join everyone at BRAC. It's a real honour to be amongst such a esteemed company, both in terms of the panelists, the other respondents, and also everyone who's attending and watching as well. I think I'll just go over a few points which have already been raised quickly. So in terms of on the point of intersectionality, which Doyen brought up, I think there's definitely kind of the gap between sort of like theory and practice, and there's a real issue in terms of the potential appropriation of that term when it comes to kind of work within the sector. And I think a lot of people have already noticed how this is coming as the othering of race in terms of wider conversations. And I think there's a real issue in terms of when people are brought in to look at this kind of work. So often things tend to be kind of reactive, which puts things in the perspective of a single issue. As opposed to being proactive, which enables kind of like a much broader and holistic understanding of intersectionality and really kind of like systems-based approaches to kind of like how we would change certain things. I also wanted to kind of just go over the bit which Yvonne was kind of saying really well about the space in terms of who we involve in these conversations, that this is rarefied knowledge, which we're kind of discussing right now, how we bring that to people who really need it. I think, like most people, when I was watching who was dying from COVID within kind of like NHS staff, the thing which did come to mind was the Snow White Beach report, but then also the thought of who got to read that report, who got to respond to it, and who got to kind of work with it and use it as a tool that it could have been in terms of sort of highlighting some of the issues which different staff members face. And I think there is definitely a problem in terms of universities or institutions thinking that they've done the work just because they've put together a report which then sits on the shelf, which doesn't reach people who can usually use it and implement it. And I think this kind of links back into kind of like how systems are orchestrated and designed to create spaces where we look to kind of a few often token individuals to kind of produce quite a lot of change when there is no kind of real institutional investment within producing different outcomes. There is at most kind of sometimes just dressing up similar practice in new clothes. I think also in terms of, if we move on to kind of education, that sort of sits within this as well. So what gets to be counted as evidence is really kind of like highlighted within that space of education. So when we look at stuff like the awarding gap, in speaking to members of staff, it's often kind of like we need more evidence, more evidence, more evidence before we kind of decide to do something about it. And it always shocks me that a regression analysis will be held in kind of like much higher esteem than an individual account or narrative in terms of how someone's felt alienated on their course, how they felt kind of very misrepresented in or unprotected in certain classroom discussions as well. Just to kind of highlight some things which Carol said as well, I really like the bit about it's not enough to have a passion for this, people are dying. And I think there is one thing in terms of just highlighting the fact that there is, you could say, a lot of goodwill, but sometimes the expertise and the real understanding and knowledge just isn't there. And I don't think there is really the systems in which to kind of hold people to account on a much broader scale, to really kind of show where things have gone wrong or kind of learn from the past. And I think this ahistoric understanding of equalities work means that we're kind of forever reinventing the wheel, and throwing out everything when something new happens. And I think in a moment like this, where I'm tempted to say this isn't necessarily yet a moment of change, but kind of a moment of interest convergence, that there is an opportunity to do something and think differently. But to really kind of understand that, I think we need to pick who we speak to in some regards. And I think as opposed to kind of talking specifically to institutions, it might be worth talking to people who are much more affected by this. And I'm not sure if kind of like the economics is there to kind of make that happen, or how we kind of think about doing different work to ensure that that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex, for that. And thank you also to all of our respondents. We're going to move into our final phase of our Equality Republic by inviting our panelists to come back to the discussion and to explore the ways ahead. I'm going to hand over to Joy, who's going to lead in this session of thinking about looking ahead, post-COVID, post-George Floyd. How do we then make this republic work? Joy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really appreciative of all of the questions, actually, and all of the things in the comments in the chat. So I just wanted to make people know that we are reading them, just very difficult to respond to everything at the same time. I suppose one thought that came to mind for me is that really the system doesn't want change. You know, actually we're in a world, I think Richard, I think Doyen, I think Carol, I think Roger, that we've all said it doesn't really want change. So if we are change makers, we have to be very alert to the fact that we are working in a system that will try to do everything it possibly can to convince us that what we're doing is really radical when it's not. That it try to convince us that we should take that award when actually the award is meaningless. There is something about our minds, really, and how we free our minds from a system that is very self-congratulatory about no change whatsoever. So I think that joining the Republic is something that is a real act of courage, because the only way that we can change anything is if we recognise ourselves as a first point of contact in this. So when we are accepting of things that are particularly rubbish, then we are almost acting in favour of the system. And that's hard, because it means that for many equality people, we're going to have to hold the mirror up to ourselves and recognise that our life's work has led us to this point. And that, you know, let me just say that our life's work has led us to a point where there is very little progress, where we are up cul-de-sacs looking for things that just lead us back to exactly the same place again. We're really not as progressive as we really want to be. So I think there's nothing more galvanizing, I think, for us at BRAP than to be doing things that other people aren't doing, because actually we know that there's a chance, a small chance, that we might be trying to tell a different type of story, to recognize that we can deconstruct ourselves from the narrative and to be outside of the status quo. Because if you're in all of that, and it's really difficult to see that there is something there that you're being seduced by. And I think that's my opening gambit. I don't know if anybody else would like to come in with their comments. Roger, we haven't heard from you for a while. Pick on the older white guy, that's what I say.
Mute myself. I knew you were going to pick on me, Joy. I think it's really good to have a space where you can say what you've just said. And I think the contributions from the respondents were really good and thought-provoking. I think a couple of quick things in terms which stray into the sort of last bit of the discussion. First of all, we need to emphasize much more inclusion, not just representation. I think it took me quite a long time to kind of fully get my head around that, but I'm now really clear on that. You can have improved representation, but without inclusion, it fades away. I think the second thing is, I think it was yourself, Joy. I've spoken at 3 trust boards in the last fortnight, and all of them, much of the conversation was about having difficult conversations. So I think you're absolutely right. That's a real problem. In fact, the willingness to have those difficult conversations is probably a good sign that a board is actually serious and not tokenistic. And I think we need to pay more attention to that. And perhaps just a kind of last quick response on one specific thing. We've spent a lot of time and a lot of money on leadership courses, and I'm not against leadership courses as such, but they're not an alternative to giving people the stretch opportunities which the evidence suggests are the key to people's career progression. So I have lost count of the number of people who've told me, while I was on a course, somebody else was acting up and guess who got the next job. And I think, so that's not an alternative to going on those courses. People go on those courses and it doesn't get built upon later. And I think that's symptomatic of a wider tokenistic issue. And perhaps finally, I said before, organizations need to take responsibility. I think we collectively need to take responsibility as well. And we don't organize collectively around it. I mean, it's bizarre to me, for example, that there's no national BME organization in the health service. There's a splintering of 50 different organizations. It would be really helpful if there was one voice with some clear messages. So I think, I mean, this has been a really good, for me, it's really, I've scribbled a whole load of things down. But I think you're right. We need to ask, why have we made so little progress? We've made some progress, but why have we made so little progress? What else do we need to do? Otherwise, we'll end up like that Einstein, wasn't it, who said, keep doing the same thing and expecting different results is an early sign of something. So let me say that.
Thanks very much, Roger. Looking ahead then, Carol, what do we need to be doing?
Wow, Sam, I've been thinking long and hard about that. One thing that really struck me, Joy, and I don't want us to step over it, is that when I saw the murder, that took place and the lynching of George Floyd, I think it was a moment, and there's been many moments since then, that I had to sit with the fact that everything that I thought I was doing to progress this agenda, and this is also looking at COVID and the disproportionate impact, and I've worked in higher education, I've worked in the not-for-profit sector, this has been my life's work. I've done different women, different places, looking at, so where are Black women, where are their voices? And I had to sit with the fact that actually, I have been part of the master's tools. I think Audre Lorde talks about the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And I have to take responsibility for colluding with that infrastructure, for colluding with not talking about the things that need to be talked about, for colluding with, actually in terms of this particular piece of work, it's actually something I should say no to, because this organization is not doing anything about what's happening to those that are most disenfranchised and marginalized. And I think I am absolutely talking about Black people. We need to focus on race in a non-negotiable way. I firmly believe, from the work that I've done in different women, different places, and everywhere else, if we focus on Black women and what their experiences are, and if we are able to progress Black women in that intersectional way, I think it will unlock a lot of things for us. But unless we're able to sit with race and the impact of racism and and lead by example and have those conversations and not skirt around the edges and make things, the infrastructure we have, remember, has been built so that the majority feel really comfortable and feel absolutely safe. That's what this infrastructure is for. So from that point of view, I really do think that we need to look again, but be accepting and work with, so what is it that has resulted to this failure? This notion that we've made some progress, a little progress, is a little progress enough? Is it enough? And also the other thing, I know it's a thing for me anyway, this BAME term, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, just as a reminder, 70% of the world are non-white. So, you know, words like minority have reinforced once again the not good enough, the, you know, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that I think I feel very passionately and strongly about. I don't know if I've got a clear, and here's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps that we can take, because I think that's failed in the past. But I think we need to respond to some of those more fundamental issues.
Thanks, Carol. I agree, actually. People are always asking, what are the 3 things I can do? And you're like, you know,
like where?
Are you serious about this? Because if you were serious about it, you would not be asking that question. Absolutely. Richard.
Yes. I found it, just going back to the panelists, Yvonne, you know, you talk about the students that you managed to get through the course, but look how hard you had to fight the system to achieve that. But it's just so stark. Regarding Jennifer's comment, talk about grenade, I fully believe that a grenade is needed. Transparency of data, I think I alluded to that in the comment earlier. Everybody looks at different things and uses different metrics to present themselves in a different light. We need absolute honesty and transparency, whether it's in higher education, whether it's in health, whether it's in the judicial system, whatever it is. You talk about equality, Athena Swan and the equality service marks and all them. I class them as tick box exercises. And you're right, how can any institution be awarded Athena Swan when there's disparities? I would challenge that all day long. And I think one of your comments is about coming together for curriculum. Absolutely. You know, people talk about the top down or the bottom up. How about the messy middle, which is a term that I quite like? Let's get everybody involved in this. And I think only when everybody is involved in any type of change, then change will probably occur.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Who haven't we had, Doreen?
Thank you, Joy. And thank you in particular to Jennifer, Yvonne, and Alex, some really provocative you know, comments there. So I guess by way of closing, I will try to wrap up my reflections as well as some additional comments based on what we heard collectively from our respondents. One first point to make, and I started it in the chat, is that when I've emphasized evidence-based, it was from the perspective of the solution rather than the perspective of the problem. Absolutely, completely understand that when we start with, all right, here is an issue, and you know, I use the word problem loosely. I know that's not the best term in this context, but there are 2 halves to it, and I'm absolutely saying, when we're saying, how do we resolve this? How do we address this? How do we change this? Let us do the work rather than, oh, for example, they set up that, they tried that, they trained that, they did that UBT, unconscious bias training, they've set up a network, let's do the same. So let's ask ourselves the question with regards to what is the evidence for this solution that is being under consideration in our particular context. And the link that I sent talks about different types of data, different sources of evidence, which I hope will attend to some of Jennifer and Yvonne's concerns, it talks about academic data or academic evidence as just one source. There's also expertise experience or data from the people who have expertise in a particular context. It also talks about the value of evidence from the people who are experiencing this. So the community, if that's the space we're working in, or the employees, if that's the space we're working in, as well as additional data from that context. So the evidence-based approach is I would say, is certainly a way forward when we want to make the change that we're kind of grappling with. How do we know what works? Let's gather evidence for various solutions. And I think my second and last point, really, I'm just going to build on what Carol said with regards to sitting with race. Absolutely. So when I talk about intersectionality, again, to repeat it, it's not about silos. We don't know enough about the different experiences relating to race within our organizations or within our community. We don't know. In the organizations I work with, we put BAME in one category. And the example I referred to earlier said, actually, if we ask this question a little bit, let's understand what's happening with race in our organization. And let's, just look at the relationship between ethnic group and gender. It gives us a different picture of what's happening with regards to race in our organization. When we work, I do a lot of work with leaders. Apologies, I don't work in the community, but there's insights from different different domains. So I can only speak to my experience or my expertise working with leaders. When we work with leaders, when we work on BME programs, we know, for example, that Asian women get different feedback with regards to their leadership potential, in air quotes, versus Black women with regards to their own leadership potential. We know that Black women are much more stereotyped to be BITCHs and bossy and aggressive, and we know that Asian women are much more stereotyped to be humble and modest. So all of this expands our race fluency. So as we're thinking about sitting with race, let's think about complicating our narratives in order to make change happen. And I will end there. Thank you again for the opportunity. Great conversation.
I just wonder, Doyen, if I can just, could you give us an example of how this might work in the Republic then? Because we've heard people say that, we can overdo the evidence. How much evidence do you need? And why not, take the critical race approach, which is to focus on story, to fill in the gaps. So could you give an example where you feel the collection of the evidence has resulted in really, the kind of change that you want to see?
Sure. So if we are kind of sitting in a particular ecosystem, so an organization, let's say, and we are saying underrepresented, when we look at our leadership pipeline, we have an overrepresentation of white men, and we have an underrepresentation of broadly speaking, non-white people, right? What I'm saying is, in this example, is don't look down the road and say, well, that organization has very similar problems. What are they doing? Let's do it because they're doing it. What I'm saying is, to some degree, so we know that HR and talent and D&I people are time poor. And so very often, and this is what the awards that Carol and Yvonne have spoken, I beg your pardon, Carol and Joy, I think, have talked about. We think it's very easy to just say, yeah, let's just do what the other people are doing. What we're saying is, when we come together and we say, how do we fix this problem? What we should better understand is, in our situation, how have people, what is leadership? As an example, what is leadership development? How has that information come about? What do our leaders and the people who are aspiring to lead us say and do? What are the values and experiences of people who aspire to this? So if you look at the link, I beg your pardon, I don't want to go into too much additional information, but the link that I sent talked about 4 different sources of evidence. what does the literature, academic literature, tell us about what people are saying about this issue? What are the people who are experts in this space? What are they telling us about this issue? What are the people who are aspiring to this pipeline, or who are currently there, or who are not there, tell us about this issue? And what additional information are we getting, e.g. from surveys or from engagement data, etc.? Putting all of that information together might suggest that actually it's not a leadership program that you need, that actually what you need to do is look at your appraisal processes, because that's what's coming up every time. So this is about not jumping onto a bandwagon or a solution, but actually pausing and saying, what do we know about what's happening with us right now?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's now 11:40, and this is the time that we plan to do our final closing session. So don't leave just yet. We've got a lot more to say. We're going to tell you how you can get involved in more activities that BRAP are planning, and we're still keen to receive your feedback. All of this is really, really helpful for planning going forward. So to pull us to a close now, I'm going to hand back over to Joy.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand to Diane, actually, pass the potato. Really just, Diane, could you just capture some themes that are coming out of the chat? Because I think it's really important that we reflect in. We want to try and be inclusive, and we know that some people have been making some really good comments and suggestions.
Morning, everybody.
Oh, yes, Anna.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. There's quite a number of things, actually. And one of the things right through the whole conversation has been about power, and how do we challenge the institutions? How do we not get seduced by power, including what power offers when we do meet whatever the targets might be that have been set for organizations and people in those roles? How do we strengthen this republic to get to action as well? Because that's one of the things. If we're doing this, we're going to talk, or we're going to start to act on things. There's something also about challenging ignorance and not forgetting not only people who aren't part of the debate as academics, but also people who would rather say all lives matter and really feel that they're doing something that's quite authentic and positive in doing that, because they can't understand what it is that's happening and what people mean by Black Lives Matter. There's a real, some of the questions are about this, people don't get it, and how do we speak to that cohort of people? So that seems to be quite important. I think people have mentioned evidence. And thinking beyond the token gestures is one of the kind of big themes that was picked up. And then something else that's come through is about, is what we're trying to do really about the things that people know, or is it about people feeling their way into understanding what is wrong with inequality, what's wrong with race discrimination, what's wrong with how we've organized and set up our society? So is there something that we're perhaps needing to do a bit more around people really getting it? And would that then be the thing that's a paradigm shift? And I think that finally, there's what I'm noticing also is maybe something around who does the work, because some are saying that actually we need government, and there's a big thing around which bit does the government come into? You know, does nothing happen if we don't get government, or is there a way in which we can start action without going back to the powers that be? You know, how do we, so the revolution piece, I think, is quite important. How do we make this happen without having to wait for the usual players to get on board, the people with power?
Thanks, Diane. Where are we now in time? So we've got 15 minutes left actually, lots to say. I think the first thing I would say is that we didn't intend to solve all of this in 2 hours. So this is, you'd be really relieved to hear that. This is the beginning of a movement. So we intend to have another webinar coming up in September on anti-racist practice. Because what I've noticed and what other people might have noticed, there's lots of people coming out the woodwork and saying they can do that now. So I think that's really important that we remember that this is not something that's actually going to be done and dusted. So the work behind the scenes is important. I'm really grateful for Diane capturing some of those themes. I think that my own maybe Robert would have something to say that, but revolutions don't usually start with a sign up from people in power. They don't kind of sit there and go, right, this is now time for a revolution. So I think if we want to do something different, then we need to do it. Definitely think that power is a huge issue. It's not necessarily about the power per se, but how it's used, the hand, you know, and I think many times we've waited for that one person to get into that position and not seen the benefits of that, because I think there is an issue around us. I think Carol said it, we need to take collective responsibility for better. We accept really, in my view, really mediocre type things on this agenda. We don't kind of dream of excellence, and that's important because I think we all deserve it. We all deserve a lot better, but that's why I think this has to be a movement that is underpinned by a lot of people that actually want better, because it cannot just be about individuals working in organisations. There's got to be something that grounds us and something that spurs us on to do much more than that. Those were my initial comments. I know a lot of people don't get it, and I think that's, I think there's an issue about who doesn't get it, but there's a lot of people that really don't get it. And I suppose our approach at BRAP has not been to try to penalise people for not getting it. But I do think there's a need to look at the type of learning we expose people to, because it's too pedestrian. It doesn't shift people. It doesn't disrupt people enough. And, you know, if we're trying to unlock people from a comfort that, you know, I've read the book, so therefore I know what it is, I know what privilege is, while still excluding every type of privilege they can. So we have to see people coming into this movement who want to disrupt themselves, who want to be part of the change, because otherwise I don't think it's going to deliver that. And, you know, I'm really grateful for people who are going to hold us to account. Do any of our sheriffs want to say anything? And then I'm going to hand back to Robert at about 5 for some final comments. I'm just giving you some alerts around that, Robert, so you don't get shocked when I hand back to you. Any final comments from people? Next steps.
I'll just say 2 very quick things. We have to show that change is possible. And as someone who spent years as a negotiator, it's what happens outside the room, not the skills of the negotiator, that make the difference. So your point about power is absolutely right. We do need the evidence, we do need the skills, we do need to show it's possible. But in the end, what will move the dial is not what other people do, it'll be what we either persuade them to do, or as a result of our existence, forces them to do. So what we as individuals do is really important, but building some kind of collective response is crucial.
Thanks, Roger. Anybody else like to come in?
Joy, I just wanted to pick up on language. I think for me, you know, we talk a lot about those that don't get it. I think we need to be clear about what getting it looks like. You know, and also it's so important not to be distracted. Toni Morrison says, you know, that racism is a distraction. There'll always be another thing. And so in this revolution, I firmly believe that we need to remain focused, completely focused, and resiliently so, and courageously so, and boldly so, and unwaveringly so, and not be distracted by, well, we don't get it, so, and I know that's not what you're saying, you know, we don't get it, so give us resources. Those that are saying things like that, I always say, in, you know, kind of white majority, the thing you need to read is yourself. Start there. That's a great book. That is a really, really good book to read. Where are you on this journey? And so as we kind of conclude, let's not get distracted.
I love that, Carol. I love that. I'm going to use that one. The book you need to read is yourself. Anything else?
Can I jump in?
Sure, Doreen, please do.
Thank you to everyone. Some phenomenal conversations. I feel fully inspired and invigorated as many of the speakers. You know, just on that theme of starting with yourself, building on what both Roger and Carol have said, I think I'd also want to say that most of us have a degree of privilege ourselves. So many of us on this call will have a mix of disadvantaged and advantaged identities. So I guess my ask for all of us is to also think through how our own privilege, in whatever sense, you know, whether it's class, whether it's education, you know, access to other resources, physical abilities, you know, whatever it is, just to what end can we also use this to advance the work that we're all kind of collectively working on.
Hello, I think...
Sorry, we are ahead of time unless anybody else wants to add anything before I hand back to you, Robert.
May I just add something? It's Asif
here.
Question from a number of people have been asking it. So there's something about what we ask of ourselves in the way Doreen's just described, but also what do we as equality practitioners ask of others? What are our demands, our asks from the organisations we're working with? What 3 things should we be asking for from those that we work with? That might be something for us to focus on going forward.
I think we can definitely focus on that. I mean, one of the things that we've done as part of our kicking off the Republic is drawing together some of the evidence that Doreen and Roger's talked about. So we've looked at what the academic research says about the impact of some of the initiatives that people are currently doing as by way of practice, and we will make that evidence available. So the people that have said, you know, what should we be doing? There's quite a lot of evidence about what you shouldn't be doing. Actually, I suppose one of the things that I hesitated in saying, but I'm going to say it now, is actually I don't think we know how to do this stuff. We've spent a lot of time being, you know, really wheeling around some of the things that we've always done and trying to get out of this and thinking, what are the things that we should absolutely do? What are the bits of things that will measure progress? What kind of interventions should we be suggesting for organisation and others that don't just address the symptoms of this problem and don't actually deal with the causes? So I think there's a lot for us to think about how we reposition ourselves and to recognise that we haven't got any major examples of things out there that have made it, and actually we're still very wedded to stuff that, you know, that's very pedestrian in for want of a better word. Robert, do you want to? Anybody else want to?
I just think we've got a few minutes, so we could probably take a couple of the questions. I know that people have put a lot of material into the chat, and also there's still a couple of questions in the Q&A as well. So Asif, go ahead if you want to add another one.
Yeah, great. So there's something about, I think a number of people have said, this isn't just about reading the book. It's not just about developing more knowledge. How do we help people get in touch with the emotional, feeling dimensions of practice that are really required to make progress?
It's a good question. I'd be intrigued to know how you engage with that, Richard, in the context of education. So, because there is more than one way of knowing about this stuff, not just the cognitive, there's the emotional experience as well, and other ways in which we produce knowledge about our predicaments. How does it work in education? How do you get people to maybe emotionally connect with this issue?
I think we have to be careful not just to group people by characteristic, but also, you know, by statistics. So we talk about regression or type statistical analysis. It's about listening to the lived voice of their experience. And there's so many lived experience details that can inform what we can do as an institution, and maybe that can be then transferred to other institutions as well. So I think we've got to be very, very careful what kind of epistemological approach that we adopt, whether it's hard quant or qual. But the qualitative analysis of the student voice, I think that informs and gives a clearer direction to the emotional experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think we've still got, use our value for money. We've still got 3 minutes left. Asif, one more to throw in, and then we're going to wrap things up.
How can we use this movement? What do we need to do next? In addition to everything else that people have said, what do we need to do next? How
That's
can we
one
use
for
it?
Joy. That's one for Joy. Joy, the next move.
Right, so only join this if you want to be disruptive. Don't join it if you just want to have a logo on your organisation's bottom of the page that says we're a member of the Equality Republic. Because as you can see, these sheriffs are wicked. They're going to be asking some stuff of us. And we are in this situation where we're demanding more. So the thinking and the practice that's required to be part of this republic is not the stuff that means that you just take a back seat. So I think about that. Think about what it means to be part of this movement. Asif, what do you want to say something about our next steps as well? Because I'm aware that you've been at the back of the call.
Sorry, I can't work out my video, which is why I'm completely blank on screen. But I mean, like you said, Joy, I think what we're looking for, just listening to the chat and the questions today, there are so many people with so many ideas and areas for inquiry. What we'd love to do is to join with you to explore some of that together. And I think what we'll be doing over the next 12 months is setting out a bit of a program, if you like, a way of doing those things. And like Joy said, the first webinar we've got is in September around racism. So we're really looking forward to join with you, but we'll be in touch before then.
Thank you. Thanks, Asif. Robert, do you want to sum up?
It. Well, I think that's it. I just want to say 3 things, really. Firstly, thank you to all our panelists and respondents for being part of this morning. You've contributed to a really fantastic debate and discussion and set the parameters for our Equalities Republic. So I want to thank you all for doing that. I want to thank also again BRAP for organising this event. We look forward to many more, and also the people working in the background with BRAP, Asif and Diane and Severine as well, who've made this morning possible. We recognise that this is just a start, and that with every republic there will be some ups and downs, there will be challenges, there will be a need to revise and revision things, but I think we've started really well in terms of recognising that the old practices just can't go on anymore, and that we all need to take new steps to make equalities work. And somebody's used a theological concept earlier on, kairos. Oh my goodness, what's happening? Our religion coming into this. It is a kairos moment, a moment which is quite unique in history compared to Chronos, the passing of times. It's a unique moment that we all need to take advantage of. So we're looking forward to the sessions that we're going to have going forward to see how we can open up some new fissures and disrupt the way in which things have gone in the past. So thank you again for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again at the next Equalities Republic held by BRAP. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.